Our next session coming right up is the politics of reuse. Has policy hit the right balance? I think I know the answer to that, but let's find out. Our very exciting panel are here to unpick that. This session is chaired by Dr. Chris Sherrington, Head of Environmental Policy and Economics at UNOMIA, who we worked with on the research paper for today's summit. Chris is an environmental economist specialising in policy analysis with extensive experience advising governments and organisations on waste management and circular economy policies. Fun fact, Chris was also one of our first ever advisors for City to Sea 10 years ago, so it's very special to still have him working with us and supporting us. He's been my phone a friend over the years of all the big, difficult questions. And I know you're going to welcome Natalie Bennett onto the panel, but 10 years ago, Natalie Bennett was also, I think, the first person I ever did a live interview with on YouTube about plastic pollution. I think we were talking microplastics at the time. So I'll stop talking and hand over to you, Chris. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Natalie. So can you hear okay? Is that working fine? Great. So I'm delighted to be here today. I was wondering where the fun fact was going, but that was fine. So thanks for that, Nat. So I'm delighted to be joined by Baroness Natalie Bennett and Dr. Debbie Fletcher for this panel on the politics of reuse. Natalie Bennett is a Green Party member of the UK House of Lords and the author of Change Everything: How We Can Rethink, Repair and Rebuild Society. She was a Green Party leader from 2012 to 2016, during which time the party received more votes than in all the previous general elections combined. Now, Natalie, I want to take a step back here because something that hasn't been said yet today. I think it's implied in everything that people have been talking about, but it's really important that reuse, like the circular economy, is a means to an end. It's not an end in itself. We need to dramatically reduce our consumption of resources to tackle the triple planetary crisis. Now, Natalie, you've written previously in the context of a proposed amendment to the Environment Bill that resource use must be slashed. It can't just be made more efficient. Mm-hmm. Now, sadly, that proposed amendment, where you called for the words resource efficiency to be replaced with reduction in resource use, was defeated. Could you give us a sense of the scale of the disconnect between what we need to do on tackling resource consumption and reducing it, and the scale of ambition among sort of members of the House of Lords and the House of Parliament?
Well, I guess an idea of the scale is I regularly say we cannot have infinite growth on a finite planet. And everyone looks terribly shocked and indicates, you can't say that. Growth is what this government is going for. Growth is what the largest opposition party wants. And many people will know Tim Jackson's Prosperity Without Growth, a very old book now, but very spread around the world. And that indicated how we cannot decouple GDP growth and carbon emissions, which we can take for as a study for the broader issues. We can reduce the carbon intensity, but where I come from and what I'm trying to point out is that there's enough resources on this planet for everyone to have a decent life, for us to look after climate and nature, if we share those resources out fairly. That's the starting point. And the other thing to say, which I'm always focusing on hopeful and positivity, doesn't sound like it at first glance, but we are currently trashing the planet and creating a thoroughly miserable society. We can stop trashing the planet and create a much better society for every human being on it, as well as for nature and climate. And I think I was with the NHS, and the NHS talks a lot about and is doing good work on sustainability, but they regard sustainability as synonymous with net zero. And climate is just the only thing they've really got in that frame. And one of the things that I do a lot of work on is the issue of what the Stockholm Resilience Centre describes as novel entities, which is the worst named planetary boundary ever. But novel entities, for my shorthands, are plastics, pharmaceuticals and pesticides. It's more than that, but 3 Ps is a nice standard thing. We have massively exceeded the planetary boundary for novel entities. And I think where this is going to become a huge public issue, and really we're going to see a huge political shift very soon, we're starting to see it already, is the fact that we have found microplastics human testes, human breast milk, human brains, and there's just been out one study showing that over the past 10 years, post-mortem show that the amount of plastic in people's brains has doubled. In the same time, the amount of plastic produced has doubled. But as we were just chatting before, this is not just an issue with plastics problem, it's a resource use issue. We have to stop single use. And all of this has only happened since about 1950. There was virtually no single-use packaging before 1950. If they could do it, we can do it too.
So it sounds like there is a disconnect, and I'm not sure whether they can tackle all those other problems at the same time conceptually, but on the resource use piece, reuse is a clear enabler of doing that. Is there much political excitement about reuse, or is it still focused on recycling as
I'm afraid recycling is where people, members of the House of Lords, will proudly come up to me and say, I recycle, you know. And, I have to make a judgment call at that point, whether I go, you know how bad plastic recycling is, and have you seen those photos from the global south of huge mounds of plastic being burnt? No, I'm afraid there's just not the political awareness. But I think, I would point to the example of we had it sort of got buried in COVID. We had a climate assembly, a people's assembly, a deliberative democracy exercise on climate. And the people actually wanted all kinds of radical things. Mm-hmm. And we've seen this again and again. The French People's Assembly is a great example. The people are far more radical than the politicians. So, I have to say at this point, the answer is elect more radical politicians.
So, also pleased to have with us Debbie, Dr. Debbie Fletcher. Debbie is the Strategy Director in the Zero Waste team at Local Partnerships. She supports national and local government in delivering waste and resource policies, with a particular focus on transitioning from recycling to reuse and repair models. She's also a member of DEFRA's Circular Economy Task Force. So Debbie, given your focus on sort of the transition from recycling to reuse, can you give us your perspective on where we are versus where we need to be on reuse?
Yeah, sure. Hi, nice to be here, everybody. So I think we've heard quite a lot this morning already around the upcoming and recently sort of established legislation that is very recycling focused. So in the UK, that's extended producer responsibility, upcoming deposit return scheme legislation, simpler recycling for households. We also have the plastics packaging tax. So there's a whole suite of quite complex legislation that's coming down the line for businesses in the recycling space, very focused on single use. So we've taken quite a while to get to this point, and we need to consider how truly circular that is. And I think we've already heard from Natalie that we need to go much further. Recycling needs to become the backstop. So in terms of the reuse space, we've had a lot of voluntary initiatives across the globe and here in the UK. We've heard from some of the trial drivers this morning. We've done that experimental phase that we had in the introductory session. So we've been experimenting to see what works and what doesn't work. Mm-hmm. We're now at the point where we need to be able to drive that through policy. So I think that we're at the point where we need to think about what does the reuse strategy for the United Kingdom look like, what does it look like for the globe, and we can draw on best practice from elsewhere, but I think we've got lots of learning to build on from within the UK, from trials that have been going on. So I think this is a pivotal point for us, really. We've spent a lot of time, with all these new ideas coming through into the mix, but now we need to take it into a full-scale action. So,
Great. And you may have read the report that we have put out accompanying this conference. One of the things that my colleagues Daniel Stunnell and Aisha Bapasola, who wrote the report, they mentioned in there. They don't use the actual term, but they're referring to incumbency. The fact that we have, as mentioned by speakers this morning, we have a system that is designed and in some respects optimised for single use. We've got lots of policies around that. We've got behaviour. We've got consumers are kind of engaged with certain types of behaviour. So it's, in many respects, it's an uphill battle. It's not a level playing field at the moment. So where do we start with that, Natalie?
Well, I would say where we don't start is with consumers. I'm not concerned with individual behaviour. I'm concerned with system change. We need to make the environmentally friendly and socially responsible thing the easiest, cheapest and simplest thing to do. It's far too much to ask individual consumers. I did a debate at Oxford Union years ago, and the topic was, and I was astonished that there was 2 Labor MPs on the affirmative side, that individual attitudes are the biggest threat to climate action. And I went, what? And I will admit I did get rather, it's still out there on YouTube somewhere, I got rather angry and rather passionate about this. Do you want to blame the single mum in Brixton who's just arrived at the shop and found she doesn't have a reusable plastic bag? Or do you want to blame the editor or the owner of the Daily Mail for where we are in terms of lack of climate action? I want to blame the editor and the owner of the Daily Mail, thank you very much, not the single mum in Brixton. And so years ago, I was, 2006, I just joined the Green Party, and I was knocking on doors for the first time, and it was on a council estate in Somers Town in Camden, and this lovely older lady, very painfully and slowly walking to the door, and it's like, sorry, I knocked on your door and made you stagger to the door, and then she was like, she looked at my green rosette and said, recycling! And nearly burst into tears, and it's like I've made an old lady cry, and but she was so upset because she couldn't get her newspapers to the recycling bin because it was 500 metres that way, and she couldn't walk with her stick and carry her newspapers. And I said to her then, as I've been saying to people since, it's not your fault, it's our fault as a society for giving you this situation.
So it's the system that needs to change, and we need to start that somewhere. Debbie, do we take it on all at once, or are there certain areas that we focus on?
I think that based on some of the analysis and the data that's been coming through from the likes of the infrastructure study that we heard about this morning, and from increasing data sources, work done by Eunomia and others, I think we need to start with those that are most easily transitionable to reusable packaging in the first instance, and we need to think about the strategic investment that's required from government and from private sector together to actually drive that in those products that are going to be easier to transition first. I think that forms the habit for consumers to understand the system, to engage with the system, and then you can start to tackle those that are more difficult from a financial perspective, perhaps from a business model perspective, from a kind of actually how to make it pragmatically usable, reusable perspective, so you can kind of build on it over time. But there's certainly some areas that you could focus on first, and I think that's where a lot of the trials have been focusing so far, is on those parts of the system where we think there is the biggest first opportunity to go and to scale, and then we build from there. And I think PPWR obviously has put reuse targets on a few key areas, so the beverage containers being one, but that didn't go far enough, and I think we can go further, and hopefully based on data, and government's always looking for data on which to base policy decision making. So it's great that we're seeing that from the room, from people within the room who've been building that data set, so we know where to target first and what is feasible, and can then sort of challenge industry, ourselves more broadly, to innovate in those spaces, and then everything will follow behind, I suspect.
Yeah, we had some good examples talked about this morning about reusable cup schemes. I think we've got a lot of evidence that's being gathered from those. And just on cups, Natalie, I've done a bit of research. On the 9th of March 2018, you wrote on Facebook, no bottle deposit scheme, no latte levy, inadequate a measure as that is, but don't worry, Tories plan to deal with unnecessary single-use plastic by 2042. So the bit I want to pick you up about is the inadequate measure as it is. What was your
Well, the inadequate
issue with it?
I think the inadequate measure as it was, if I'm remembering correctly, there was I gave a speech which was slightly infamous. I got accused, in the House of Lords, you're supposed to be polite, and I got accused of not being polite to the Tory minister because it was when we brought in bans on, you'll remember these, plastic straws, cotton buds, and stirrers, and we had this speech from the minister going, "Well, won't the future be really pleased with us because we've banned plastic stirrers, plastic cotton buds and plastic straws?" And I kind of went, to paraphrase the speech, it was along the lines of, in the future, when they're weighed down with the enormous weight of plastic coating the planet, choking the planet, they're going to say, yes, but we're really glad that they banned plastic stirrers. That was a big step forward.
But just on the latte levy, I mean,
I
was...
No, okay, sorry.
I was
wrong
one
It
of
was
a few people at the time. I mean, I hate the name. I think that it suggests it's the levy is on the drink rather than the cup. I think a throwaway cup tax would have been better. But I think, the thing for me is that it's not clear at the moment. You get discounts in some places. We heard this morning about we need those financial incentives to make the difference, and it feels this is a fairly easy win. And actually, there's arguably more of a rationale now for putting it in, because not only have you got the alternative of people bringing their own, but you've got these reusable cup systems. Would you describe such a measure, if not called latte levy, now as part of it?
Well, it's a small step forward.
Yeah.
And, I'll tell you something, to reach into my handbag, which I've got down here now, and, wave where I got several cups of tea and coffee on my long journey here this morning. Most places, when you hand this over, they yell out to the people behind them, the barista, "Special cup!" That's still special. So we're just so far. But I don't think it should be on. I know many men don't carry handbags, or I think you're supposed to call them something else, but whatever. It shouldn't be up to the consumer. It has to be the responsibility on the suppliers. But, we have huge structural problems here. How many shops have washing up facilities? You think of all of those coffee shops in stations. I was in Leicester University Union one time, just watching why there's a Starbucks in Leicester University Union, I do not know, watching everyone going to the Starbucks, and it had no washing up facilities. You cannot be allowed to build that, and you're going to have to retrofit it to fix it.
And it's something that France has mandated, above a certain size, for eating. Should be using reusables.
I went viral on, I think it was still Twitter in those days. I went viral on Twitter with a photo of my lunch in Cologne's train station, in those totally random things, because I just had, a sort of basic Chinese, what you would normally think of as takeaway lunch, but I ate in, and there was no single-use materials. Not a single thing on my tray was single-use. It's not rocket science.
And Debbie, I know you've been to Denmark. You've seen the system in Aarhus. And my understanding is you don't need each place to have their own dishwasher there. Could you talk a bit about the system?
Yeah, so that's a sort of open system, as you'd call it. So essentially, it's the logistics company distributes the cups out across the retailers. You can pick up your cup and you drop it back into an RVM just out on the street, essentially, and get your money back from that RVM, and they collect them centrally and take them back to a central wash facility. And I think part of the challenge here with the kind of scaling up is those wash facilities are critical because they need to be extremely water efficient as well. From a life cycle analysis perspective, we need to go beyond the dishwashers and so on and actually into really sort of efficient infrastructure. So that's all part of why we need to scale up, because then the environmental impacts scale with it at the same time. It was a fantastic system, but I think we come back to needing the policy still, because that system, they'd made cost parity in terms of the reuse versus the single use through sort of a subsidised investment. But still, the retailers, the uptake from retailers was only 5 to 10%. And still, even within that, the consumers would often, even if they literally would be on the front, as soon as you come in your coffee shop, the retailers would go for the single-use option. So we need, there's, even if you put in place a system which is really easy for a consumer to do, and easy for a retailer to engage with because it's cost parity, you're still getting blockers. Mm-hmm. So they're looking at pushing up through policy in Denmark at the moment because they've recognised the system works, we can scale it, but actually now we need to build the policy environment around it to really change that direction and also then provide bigger investment, I think, to drive that forwards.
Yeah, and I think it's an important point you make about, we need the scale for it to be cost effective, and it's all about the environmental impact. We need to drive that down through that sort of efficiency of the system. So, one thing that strikes me about the difference between what businesses can do with like optimizing design for recycling versus reuse systems is that optimizing design for recycling is something that business can do on its own. But reuse, it requires that collaboration, it requires people working together, as we heard from James. I expect this to be my most memorable quote of the day. I struggle to find first mover advantage in the sustainability agenda, but more broadly, I think the challenge is on reuse. No one wants to go first with it. Who wants to sink those costs? It reminds me of penguins at the edge of an ice sheet, not wanting to be the first one to jump in. So what we need collective action, and what's the role of government in this? Natalie, how are we going to hold everyone's hands to make this happen?
I think we will just say this has got to happen for public health, for environmental health, for the state of the world. Mm-hmm. This has to happen. And, I think it's not very hard to imagine. I've been through several train stations today. Sandwiches in reusable, returnable packets. And, lots of consumers inevitably will not return those. But someone's going to go down that train and pick up all the things they've got a deposit on it and make some money out of it. And that's what happens, obviously, with the bottle deposit schemes. Mm-hmm. It has a big impact on litter because even if the person who bought it doesn't take it back, someone does. The government has to say, and, there's a piece on Huffington Post with the former head of ASDA, saying we have to just say, ultimately, where we have to go is end single-use packaging. Mm-hmm. Unless you can show, raw meat, there's a few things that may be necessary, but broadly speaking, pretty well everything we buy could be in a reusable packet. Mm-hmm. And the government just has to say that is the norm. And, the French government has started to go that way, in that direction. And, that's where we have to go. And I think there would be enormous public support for that.
So we can, one of the things that was talked about with the PPWR earlier on was it sets that clear direction of travel. It tells you 10 years, 20 years hence, this is where we want to be. But the other thing we heard was the playing field is very unlevel, and it's a transition. It's going to be the hardest bit will be the start, because things will be building up, they won't be as efficient as they will be, so the system won't be optimal, and there'll be a lot of costs up front. So if we know where we get to, Debbie, we can say we're going to ban these things in this time, but how do you try and push that transition? Is it about, do you need stronger financial incentives to encourage reuse, not just on the consumer, but more broadly?
I think it's partly financial, and then it's partly about how you get people into... The government has a role to play in ensuring that there's collaboration across industry, across getting disruptors and incumbents in the room to really work together, to actually try and get to as much standardisation as possible within the system that's going to be developed, to make sure, not least, that actually we have a substantial number of small businesses in the UK, in comparison to some of the other systems. If you're thinking of DRS, for instance, where it's come from in kind of much more big hypermarket-based locations across Europe. We have loads of small shops still here. I'm very proud of them. But they are going to struggle in some of these systems to be part of that conversation and to make sure that they're part of the pooled systems that are needed, so that they can be part of the efficiency and aren't left out as well. So we need to... So there's definitely financial requirement to kind of prime some of this infrastructure, I think. But there's also a need to then get the people around the table to make sure we're standardising where we can to develop sort of efficient sets of systems. But there are different solutions, as we've heard earlier, for some of the different packaging types as well. So it's also about working out how they fit together and how we can make that consumer journey as easy as possible, so we actually get the returns we need. Yeah,
and I think, it was Amy or Sarah who mentioned it in the earlier panel discussion that legislation often drives the market on this. It drives the commercial viability. And I'm thinking back to the landfill tax, which to start with was trying to internalise the external costs, some of which we've talked about. But then it actually went beyond that, and it gave that, sort of the escalator gave that clear view of where things were going. And perhaps we need something similar on reuse. I've had the 5 minute, I've had the 1 minute, and I suspect we are slightly over time now, so we better leave it there. But thank you to both my panellists.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks. We thought we'd go to some online questions.
Okay.
Oh, I feel like I'm on Country File or something from our viewers. We've had Neil, who has been very engaged, asking lots of questions. Thanks, Neil. Question for Debbie Fletcher. Does circular economy planning need to be included as an obligation for new unitary authorities in the legislation about to go through Parliament?
Good question. Circular economy plan. So circular economy action planning, I think, does need to be something that all local government is instilling within their activities going forward. I think a lot of the challenges that we're talking about here, though, are very much at a kind of a national government scale. So there's only so much that local authorities can do they're more delivery vehicles for when we're talking about things like waste, essentially, and we need to work out what their role is in all of these conversations. So I think I'm really interested to sort of hear more about and think more about what does local authorities collect all our waste at the moment, because it's waste, and then they send some for recycling and so on. But when we shift over into a reuse system, they may still be a service provider. They may be one of multiple service providers. So what is their role within that in terms of facilitating the circular economy? And until we kind of answer these questions at a more strategic national level, it can be quite hard for them to write beyond where they are now and beyond the upcoming policies that they have to face in the waste space. But certainly in terms of public procurement, for instance, and when they're procuring services and products and things, they should be incorporating circular economy into the public procurement space.
Mm-hmm.
So.
And I'll just add, thanks, Neil, because that certainly gives me something to think about when the bill comes to the House of Lords. But I will make the point that we are talking about what are going to be severely under-resourced. We increasingly have a problem where local government essentially can only act as an agent of the central government, because when you look at social care costs and children's care costs, there's nothing else left.
Yeah.
So, there's got to be realistic. If there's not resources, they're not going to be able to pick it up.
And we had one more online, and this was, I think, the first part of the question was for Debbie, the second part for Natalie. Why does the UK government ignore data from other countries, for example, France? I think, Debbie, you were saying we need data, the government needs data, so I think that references that. And the second part of the question, and how do we get the government to adopt a percentage ring fence of EPR for reuse as in France? So I think for both of you.
Okay. So I wouldn't say government ignores data. I think it's constantly mining for data, but it's kind of balancing up that, is that representative of the United Kingdom situation, and what else do we need to know? And I think part of the problem here is that even where there is some legislation in place, for instance, in France and in Luxembourg, and now we have PBWR, that's all still quite early stages as well. So the data coming out of that, we're still waiting for that transformation to be able to, build on that ourselves as a country. So, but they definitely don't ignore any data. They're mining for world data all the time and looking for best practice. But, I think we're at that kind of point where we're still waiting for things to bed in those places where there has been legislation put in place. So in the interim, it's great that we're also starting to look at our own kind of detailed data and flows and making sure that we can take decisions based on both, essentially.
Thank you very much for the question, because it gives me a chance to say my favourite phrase, which is, we need a world where everyone makes politics what they do, not have done to them. And we've had politics being done to us for a long time. And change is never delivered by the status quo. And who has most influence, who has most in on the government? It's the status quo. So it's all of you collectively that need to create the pressure points to make it happen. Change will only be delivered when that happens. And that means, it doesn't mean that you personally have to go and pound on the gates of Westminster and say, give us a bottle deposit scheme. But do what you can, make the voice out there, let everyone know that it's possible, and build the pressure up wherever you can, in whatever spaces you can. So do politics is the answer.
That was from Sarah, thank you. And we've just got one in from Natalie Fee from City to Sea. And she says, our single-use cup levy petition had 250,000 signatures on it. And that didn't see adoption from government. We've currently been running our single-use petition, our dine-in petition to ban single-use in dine-in settings, as has happened in Europe. But we don't seem to be getting the buy-in from government when there is public demand. What more can we do?
I think my answer to that would be that I think lots of people are really disappointed when they do one political thing and they can't see an impact. And my case study for this is always, some people in the room at least will remember, there was 1 million people marched on the streets of London before the Iraq War, saying to Tony Blair, don't go to war. And Tony Blair went to war anyway. But 10 years later, there was actually a vote in the Commons on whether we would bomb Syria or not. And as a reaction to the political impact on the Labour Party of the Iraq War, they voted against bombing Syria. And then after the British Parliament voted against that, then Obama decided that America couldn't do it either. So politics is cumulative. It's like building a wave. And if you're standing on the shore, you mightn't be able to see it. There's a tsunami out there, and it's only as it approaches the shore it gets bigger and bigger. So it's very, very seldom that one petition, one action delivers change. If you think of it as that building wave, and political change doesn't happen slowly and gradually. Political change happens in big jumps. And I often quote, or paraphrase anyway, Gramsci, when the old is dying and the new is yet to be born, there's lots of nasty things in the interregnum. And that's kind of where we are now. But when change happens, it happens really fast. The last real political change in the UK was the election of Margaret Thatcher. Hasn't really changed since then, but we're waiting for the next change now. And, people sometimes say, but couldn't it turn out badly? And yes, it could. But history is not pre-written. History is made by the actions of people. So everyone who signed one of those petitions has just built that wave up a little bit. And, if you sign the petition and then get 10 of your friends to sign it, then you've added a bit more to the wave. It's all cumulative.
Thanks again to my two panellists. Thank you.
Thank you.